The barking wouldn't stop. 3 nights straight now, and Max's deep, guttural warnings echoed through the old farmhouse like thunder. James Calloway pressed the pillow against his ears, his weathered hands trembling slightly, not from age, but from something deeper, something the neighbors would never see. "Jim," Eleanor whispered beside him, her hand finding his shoulder in the darkness. "Maybe we should listen to him this time." "It's nothing, Ellie," he growled, though the German shepherd's persistence had begun to unnerve even him. Downstairs, Max's barking intensified, no longer just alert, but desperate. The 90-pound shepherd wasn't just barking at shadows. He was fixed on a single spot near the living room hearth, his powerful body rigid, hackles raised. Then came the sound. Faint at first, a creak beneath the floorboards that didn't belong. Jim's combat-trained senses jolted fully awake. The house seemed to sigh, settling into something unstable below. Max fell suddenly, eerily silent. That's when they felt it. The floor beneath their bed shifted, almost imperceptibly. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. James Jim Calloway's farmhouse sat on 5 acres of Nebraska flatland, weathered by 68 harsh winters and baked by just as many summers. The 2-story colonial had belonged to Jim's father before him, and his grandfather before that, a legacy of Calloway men who worked the land until their bodies gave out. The house itself was a testament to stubborn resilience, with its original hardwood floors, hand-carved banister, and foundation laid before the Great Depression. At 62, Jim carried himself with the rigid posture of a man who'd seen combat and never quite left it behind. Vietnam had taken his youth, his innocence, and for many years, his peace of mind. He'd returned with a purple heart, a slight limp from shrapnel in his left leg, and nightmares that still sometimes woke him sweating and disoriented. His calloused hands and sun-weathered face told the story of a man who believed problems were solved through labor, not talk. The locals respected Jim, but kept their distance. Something about those distant blue eyes suggested depths best left undisturbed. Eleanor. Ellie Calloway had been a military nurse when she met Jim at a VA hospital in '73. At 60, her once auburn hair had gone completely white, framing a face still pretty despite the web of fine lines around her eyes. Unlike her husband, Ellie wore her heart openly, serving as the bridge between Jim and the world. When Jim retreated into silence, it was Ellie who translated his needs and moods. She volunteered 3 days a week at the county clinic, her capable hands still steady when bandaging wounds or comforting the sick. Max had come into their lives 3 years ago, already past his prime at 6 years old. The German shepherd had been slated for euthanasia at the county shelter when Ellie spotted him, military-trained but deemed unadoptable due to his intensity and occasional aggression. Something in the dog's wary, watchful eyes had reminded her of Jim. Against her husband's initial objections, she'd brought Max home, insisting that the dog deserved a second chance, just as Jim had after the war. Gradually, reluctantly, man and dog had formed an uneasy alliance, united perhaps by some unspoken recognition of shared trauma. The trouble began on a Tuesday in late March, when the first spring thunderstorms rolled across the plains. Jim had been reading his newspaper in his worn leather armchair when Max, typically content to doze near the wood stove, suddenly stood at attention. The German shepherd's ears perked forward, his body tensing as he stared intently at a spot near the stone hearth. "What is it, boy?" Jim muttered, barely glancing up from the sports section. Max responded with a low growl that gradually built into a series of sharp, urgent barks. Jim folded his paper with an irritated sigh. "Ellie, your dog's acting up again." Eleanor appeared in the doorway, drying her hands on a dish towel. "He's your dog, too, Jim, and he doesn't bark without reason. Probably just a mouse in the walls," Jim said, reaching for his coffee. But Max wouldn't be quieted, pacing a tight circle before returning to the same spot, his nails clicking against the hardwood as he scratched insistently at the floor. That night, the barking continued intermittently. By morning, Jim's patience had worn thin. "That animal kept me up half the night," he complained over breakfast, dark circles shadowing his eyes. "Maybe we should let him sleep in the barn for a while." Eleanor's lips tightened. "He's never spent a night outside since we got him. I'm not starting now." The pattern repeated the next day, and the next. Max would seem normal for hours, following Jim around the property as he checked fences and tended to his small vegetable garden, but inevitably, when they returned to the house, the dog would fixate on that same spot by the hearth, barking with increasing desperation. By the weekend, the situation had escalated. During dinner with their neighbors, the Hendersons, Max's barking became so disruptive that Jim finally locked him in the mud room, his face flushed with embarrassment. "Sorry about that," he muttered as he returned to the table. "Dog's been acting strange all week." Bill Henderson, a retired veterinarian, raised an eyebrow. "Might want to get him checked out, Jim. Sudden behavior changes can indicate health problems. Or he's just being stubborn." Jim replied tersely, effectively ending the conversation. Later that night, as Eleanor prepared for bed, she found Jim sitting at the edge of their mattress, staring at his trembling hands. "It's getting worse, isn't it?" she asked softly. Knowing she wasn't just talking about the dog, Jim nodded almost imperceptibly. The nightmares had returned. Vietnam flashbacks triggered by Max's incessant barking. The sound reminded him too much of the warning barks from the military dogs before an ambush. "I can take him to Dr. Ma Miller on Monday," Eleanor offered, sitting beside him. "And tell him what? That our dog won't stop barking at the floor." Jim shook his head. "We'll sound crazy." By day 7, the entire household existed in a state of sleep-deprived tension. Jim had taken to wearing his old shooting earmuffs around the house. Eleanor had called Dr. Miller anyway, only to be told nothing could be done without bringing Max in, and Max, if anything, had grown more frantic, refusing to eat and barely sleeping, his attention fixed with single-minded determination on the spot by the hearth. That evening, as a particularly violent spring storm lashed at the windows, the standoff reached its breaking point. Jim had just dozed off in his armchair when Max's barking jolted him awake. Something in the animal's tone had changed. There was a desperate quality to it that pierced through Jim's irritation. "That's it," he said, rising stiffly from his chair. "I'm going to figure out what's got him so worked up." Eleanor watched anxiously as Jim knelt beside Max, his bad knee protesting. For the first time, he really looked at the section of floor that had so captivated the dog. The wide oak planks seemed ordinary enough, weathered by decades of foot traffic. "I don't see anything, boy," Jim said, but without his usual gruffness. He ran his hand over the wood, feeling for anything unusual. Then he paused, brow furrowing. "Huh. What is it?" Eleanor asked, moving closer. Jim pressed his palm flat against the floor. "Feel that there's a draft coming up between these boards. That shouldn't happen." As if responding to Jim's discovery, Max whined and pawed more urgently at the spot. Jim and Eleanor exchanged a troubled glance. For the first time in a week, they were both thinking the same thing. Maybe Max had been trying to tell them something all along. The next morning dawned gray and drizzly as Jim retrieved his toolbox from the garage. He'd slept poorly, his dreams filled with echoes of barking dogs and distant explosions. Ellie had convinced him to take a closer look at that section of flooring, if only to prove there was nothing to worry about. "I still think we're humoring a neurotic dog," Jim grumbled as he knelt by the hearth. Wincing as his bad knee protested, Max sat nearby, unusually calm now that Jim was addressing the source of his concern. The shepherd's intelligent eyes followed Jim's every move. His ears perked forward in focused attention. "Look at him," Ellie said, bringing Jim a mug of black coffee. "He knows you're finally listening." Jim grunted noncommittally and set to work, carefully prying up the edge of one floorboard with a crowbar. The aged oak resisted at first, then gave way with a groan that sounded almost human. Jim paused, an unexpected chill running down his spine. "Jim, what is it?" Ellie asked, noticing his hesitation. "Nothing," he muttered, though both knew it was a lie. As he lifted the board completely, Max moved closer, his nose twitching with interest. Jim shone a flashlight into the narrow opening, revealing the expected joists and subfloor below. But as the beam swept across the cavity, something glinted back, something that didn't belong. Jim reached into the space, his fingers closing around cold metal. When he withdrew his hand, he was holding a set of military dog tags. "What on earth?" Ellie breathed, leaning in for a closer look. Jim turned the tags over in his palm, reading the stamped information, his face drained of color. "These are canine identification tags, military working dog tags." Ellie's brow furrowed. "But how—" "I don't know," Jim said, his voice uncharacteristically tight. "But they're not just any tags. They're from the war, Vietnam." The discovery unleashed something in Jim, a flood of memories he'd spent decades trying to contain. He sat heavily on the floor, the tags clutched in his trembling hand, as sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool spring air. "Jim!" Ellie's voice seemed to come from far away. "Jim, stay with me." The familiar pressure was building in his chest, the prelude to a panic attack he hadn't experienced in years. Images flashed before him, jungle heat, the weight of his M16, the shepherd mix named King, who'd saved his platoon by detecting a tripwire seconds before they would have triggered it. Max's wet nose against his hand snapped Jim back to the present. The dog had moved to his side, pressing against him in an unusual display of physical comfort. "I need some air," Jim managed, struggling to his feet. He stumbled out onto the porch, Max following close behind. Ellie found them there 10 minutes later. Jim seated on the steps with Max's head in his lap, a level of intimacy the two had never before shared. "Who lived here before your parents bought the place?" she asked quietly. Settling beside him, Jim shook his head. "Some older couple. Morton, I think. I was just a kid when we moved in." "Could they have had a son who served, who maybe brought home a military dog?" "Maybe." Jim turned the tags over again. They read Bravo 055237K9, followed by a series of numbers and the blood type. But why would these be hidden under the floor? That afternoon, while Ellie called the county records office, Jim reluctantly phoned Bill Henderson. The retired vet arrived within the hour, his interest piqued by Jim's uncharacteristic request for help. Military working dogs weren't always treated like they are today, Bill explained as he examined the tags. Back in Vietnam, they were classified as equipment. When the war ended, many were euthanized or left behind. Bringing them home wasn't standard procedure. Jim's jaw tightened. I remember. But some handlers couldn't bear to abandon their partners. There were cases of soldiers smuggling their dogs home, keeping them under the radar. You think that's what happened here? Someone brought back a war dog illegally. Bill shrugged. It's possible. The fact that the tags were hidden suggests someone wanted to conceal the dog's military origin. As the men talked, Max continued his vigil by the opened floor section. Occasionally, he would whine softly and look back at Jim, as if urging him to continue searching. Jim had dismissed Max's behavior as random canine anxiety. But now, with those military tags cold in his palm, a different possibility emerged. What if Max, himself a former service dog, had somehow sensed something the humans had missed? What if his military training had enabled him to detect some danger invisible to ordinary perception? When Ellie returned from making calls, her expression was troubled. Jim, I found something. The Mortons did have a son, Robert Morton. He served in Vietnam as a dog handler, according to local history. He came home in '72 with what people called shell shock. He lived here with his parents until their deaths in the early '80s, then stayed on alone until he passed in '85. Before your family bought the place, Bill noted. Jim stared at the opened floor. And you think he brought his war dog back with him, hid its identity? It would explain the tags, Ellie said, but not why Max is so agitated now, decades later. As if on cue, the German shepherd began pawing at the floor, opening again, his movements more insistent. Jim made a decision then, one that surprised even himself. Get me the pry bar again, and a bigger flashlight. Max is trying to tell us something, and I think I'm finally ready to listen. The discovery of those military tags had broken something open in Jim, not just the floor of his home, but the carefully constructed barriers he'd built around his own war experiences. As he prepared to delve deeper into the mystery beneath his feet, he couldn't shake the feeling that he and Max were somehow meant to uncover whatever secret lay hidden there. As the afternoon stretched into evening, Jim methodically expanded the opening in his living room floor. Each board came up easier than the last, as if the house itself was finally ready to relinquish its secrets. Ellie brought lamps from around the house, creating a pool of harsh light around the growing hole, while Bill Henderson sat in Jim's armchair, occasionally offering observations. The construction down there looks original, Bill noted, leaning forward to peer into the cavity. These supporting joists are hand-hewn oak. They don't build them like that anymore. Jim grunted in acknowledgement, too focused on his task to engage in conversation. Max remained close, his attention divided between Jim and the expanding darkness below. Occasionally, the dog would whine or nudge Jim's arm, as if directing his efforts. By the time Jim had removed a 3-foot square section of flooring, the true nature of what lay beneath began to reveal itself. The joists and supporting beams showed clear signs of water damage, dark stains spreading like cancer through the grain of the wood, and in several places, the unmistakable white bloom of fungal growth. That doesn't look good, Ellie murmured, handing Jim a towel to wipe the sweat from his brow. Jim sat back on his heels, surveying the damage with the construction veteran's eye. No, it doesn't. There's significant rot here. This beam, he pointed to a major support running beneath the fireplace. It's practically hollow in sections. Bill came to kneel beside him, careful to keep his balance on the intact portion of the floor. Could this be what Max was sensing? Dogs can smell mold and rot that humans can't detect. Maybe, Jim conceded, though his expression remained troubled. But this kind of damage takes years, decades even. Why would he start barking about it now? The answer came as Jim directed his flashlight deeper into the crawl space. The beam caught something embedded in one of the rotting joists, another metal object, different from the dog tags. Using a screwdriver, Jim carefully pried it loose and held it up to the light. A bullet, corroded with age, but unmistakable. Vietnam era, Jim said quietly, turning the ammunition in his fingers. M16 standard issue. Ellie's hand went to her mouth. "Jim, there's something else," he interrupted, his voice strangely detached as he played the flashlight beam along the underside of the subfloor. Scratches marked the wood in several places deep, desperate gouges that could only have been made by powerful claws. Max whined loudly, pressing his muzzle against Jim's arm. "I think I need to get down there," Jim said, his decision already made. "Jim, your knee," Ellie began. "I'll be fine." His tone brooked no argument. With Bill's help, Jim lowered himself into the crawl space, the tight quarters forcing him to navigate on his stomach. Army crawl style, the familiarity of the position, elbows digging into dirt, chin tucked. Breath controlled triggered a cascade of memories, night patrols through Mekong Delta, rice paddies. The weight of fear pressing him into the earth as enemy fire whistled overhead. "Jim," Ellie's voice called him back. "What do you see?" He blinked, refocusing. More of the same damage. "But there's something else." His flashlight had illuminated a corner of the crawl space that appeared different from the rest, the dirt packed more firmly, deliberately smoothed. Setting the light aside, Jim began to dig with his hands, the cool earth yielding easily beneath his fingers. 6 inches down, he felt it fabric, wrapped around something solid. Carefully, he excavated the bundle and pulled it toward him. "I'm coming up," he called, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. When he emerged, dirt-streaked and grimacing from the pain in his knee, Jim was holding a small, disintegrating canvas bundle. He laid it gently on the intact portion of the floor and, with trembling fingers, unwrapped it. Inside was a weathered leather collar, cracked with age, but still intact enough to read the name stamped into its surface. "Bravo." "The dog from the tags," Ellie whispered. Tucked with the collar was a faded photograph, a young soldier kneeling beside a powerful German shepherd. Jungle visible in the background. On the back, written in fading blue ink, "Robert and Bravo, Kasan, 1969. Jim stared at the items, his mind racing to assemble the pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known existed. "Robert Morton brought his dog home," he said finally. "Kept him hidden, kept his military identity secret." "But why bury the collar under the house?" Bill asked. The answer came to Jim with devastating clarity. Because that's where Bravo died, and where Robert put him to rest. The realization settled over the room like a shroud. Max moved to sniff at the collar, then looked up at Jim with those knowing eyes, eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of his entire species. "He smells another military dog," Jim said quietly. "One that served like he did, one that—" His voice trailed off, unable to complete the thought. That night, after Bill had gone home with promises to return in the morning, Jim sat alone on the porch steps, the collar and photograph beside him. Ellie had tactfully gone to bed, understanding his need for solitude. Max lay at his feet, more peaceful than he'd been in days. The pieces were starting to fit together in Jim's mind, forming a picture at once tragic and familiar. Robert Morton, returning from Vietnam with invisible wounds and a smuggled war dog. His only comfort in a world that didn't understand what he'd endured, The pair, aging together in this isolated farmhouse, until finally, Jim's thoughts were interrupted by a memory so vivid it stole his breath himself at 19. Crouched in jungle undergrowth as a German shepherd named King alerted to movement ahead, saving his entire platoon from an ambush. King, who had been left behind when Jim's tour ended, classified as equipment too costly to transport home. "I left him there," Jim whispered to the darkness, words he'd never spoken aloud. "I just left him there." Max raised his head at the sound, resting his muzzle on Jim's knee in a gesture so gentle it nearly undid him. The next morning brought rain, a steady, soaking downpour that drummed against the roof and turned the farmyard to mud. Jim woke early, his dreams haunted by barking dogs and the face of Robert Morton, a man he'd never met but whose pain he suddenly understood all too well. Over coffee, he shared his theory with Ellie. "I think Robert Morton brought Bravo home illegally after Vietnam, kept him here in secret. When Bravo died, he couldn't bear to bury him outside, maybe feared someone would discover the military tags, or maybe just wanted to keep him close. So he created a space under the floor, buried his partner there." Ellie's eyes were soft with compassion, but the structural damage, the rot, probably started after Robert died. No one to maintain the house properly, check for leaks or seepage. Then your father and I bought the place, but we never knew what was under there, never had reason to check. "Until Max," Ellie said. "Ellie," Jim nodded, watching the German shepherd doze by the kitchen door, finally at peace now that his warnings had been heeded. "Until Max." The ringing of the phone interrupted them. Ellie answered, her expression growing increasingly concerned as she listened. When she hung up, she turned to Jim with worry etched across her features. "That was the Weather Service. They've upgraded the spring storm warning to a flood watch. The Peterson Creek Dam is at capacity, and if it breaches, we'd be right in the path." Jim finished. Their property sat in the lowest part of the valley, with the creek running along its eastern boundary. He glanced at the exposed section of floor, at the rotting beams already compromised by years of slow water damage. If those support joists fail during flooding, the whole central section of the house could collapse, Ellie concluded, her nurse's practicality taking over. "We need to call a structural engineer, and we may need to evacuate." Jim's jaw tightened. "No! Jim! I'm not leaving," he said firmly. "Not with Robert and Bravo still down there, not with what we now know." Ellie recognized the set of his shoulders, the determination in his eyes. It was the same look he'd had when he'd finally agreed to therapy for his PTSD 15 years ago. Not because the doctors urged it, but because he'd decided, on his own terms, that he was ready to face his demons. "Okay?" she said finally. "Then we shore it up ourselves, at least enough to get through this storm." Jim called Bill Henderson back, along with 2 other Vietnam veterans from town men who wouldn't ask too many questions and who understood the unspoken code of having another soldier's back. By noon, 4 pickup trucks were parked in the Callaway driveway, and the living room had been transformed into a construction zone. As the men worked, Ellie made calls to the County Historical Society and the Veterans Affairs Office. Piecing together more of Robert Morton's story, what emerged was a narrative all too familiar to those who understood the war's aftermath. A decorated K-9 handler who returned home withdrawn and haunted, who rarely left the family farm, whose only companion was a dog neighbors assumed he'd acquired after the war. There's no record of him ever seeking VA benefits or treatment, Ellie reported to Jim during a brief break. He just Disappeared into himself. Jim nodded, unsurprised. Men of that generation didn't talk about such things, and admitting he'd smuggled a military dog home would have meant legal troubles. "Like you with your PTSD," she said gently. "All those years of silence." Jim's gaze drifted to Max, who had appointed himself supervisor of the renovation efforts, moving between the workers with an air of approval. Maybe that's why Max was so fixated on this spot. Maybe he recognized something of himself down there. By late afternoon, the temporary supports were in place, not a permanent solution, but enough to prevent immediate collapse should the waters rise. Outside, the rain continued unabated, the distant sound of the swollen creek a constant reminder of the threat. The other men had gone, leaving Jim, Ellie, and Max alone with the increasingly violent storm. As darkness fell, they gathered in the kitchen, the farthest point from the compromised floor section. The battery-powered radio delivered a steady stream of weather updates, none of them encouraging. "The evacuation order is for everyone east of Highway 16. Ellie noted, studying the county emergency map spread on the table. "That includes us." Jim shook his head. "I told you, I'm not leaving." "Jim, I left one dog behind in Vietnam," he said, his voice suddenly raw with emotion. "I won't leave another one buried under my house to be washed away. I won't leave Robert's memory to disappear like he never existed." Ellie looked at her husband, really looked at him, and saw not the stubborn, closed-off man who had resisted therapy and emotional connection for decades, but a soldier still trying to make peace with choices forced upon him half a century ago. "Then I'm staying too," she said quietly. "But Max goes with the Hendersons. Bill offered to take him when he left." Jim started to protest, then stopped, acknowledging the wisdom in her words. Max was still relatively young, with years ahead of him. If the worst happened, "Okay," he conceded, "but just Max. You should go too." Ellie's smile was small but determined. 42 years of marriage. "Jim Calloway, when have I ever left your side when it mattered?" Outside, the rain intensified, drumming against the roof like distant artillery fire. Max raised his head, alert to the changing rhythm of the storm, as somewhere in the darkness, Peterson Creek continued to rise, carrying with it the weight of unspoken histories and the promise of reckonings long overdue. Midnight brought the full fury of the storm. Rain lashed against the windows in horizontal sheets, driven by winds that howled through the eaves like lost souls. Jim stood at the kitchen window, watching lightning illuminate the flooded farmyard in stark, electric flashes. The creek, normally a gentle presence at the edge of their property, had transformed into a roaring monster, its banks already breached in several places. "Creek's up another foot," he reported grimly, returning to the table where Ellie sat with the battery-powered radio. "Waters reached the edge of the barn." Ellie nodded, her face pale in the lantern light. The power had gone out an hour earlier, plunging the old farmhouse into a darkness broken only by their emergency lights and the occasional lightning flash. "They're saying the Peterson Creek Dam is showing signs of stress, if it fails." "I know." Jim's voice was tight but calm, the same controlled tone Ellie recognized from other crises over their decades together. It was his combat voice, the one that emerged when mere survival became the objective. Max had refused to leave with the Hendersons. When Bill arrived to collect him, the German shepherd had planted himself beside Jim with such immovable determination that even Ellie had relented. "Some battles aren't worth fighting," she'd said. watching the profound communication that passed between man and dog. Now Max patrolled the kitchen anxiously, his nails clicking on the linoleum as he moved from window to door and back again. A tremendous crack of thunder directly overhead made even Jim flinch. The sound was followed by an ominous creak from the direction of the living room. "The supports," Jim muttered, already moving toward the sound, flashlight in hand. Ellie and Max followed close behind as Jim made his way carefully into the living room. The temporary bracing they'd installed beneath the damaged floor section still held, but water had begun to seep up between the remaining floorboards, a dark stain spreading slowly across the worn oak. "Groundwater's rising," Jim said, kneeling to touch the dampness. Pushing up from below, Ellie's hand found his shoulder. "Jim, I think we need to reconsider." Her words were cut short by the emergency radio crackling to life in the kitchen, its automated alert tone piercing through the storm noise. They hurried back to hear the announcement. "The National Weather Service has issued a flash flood warning for eastern Webster County. The Peterson Creek Dam has been compromised." Repeat. "The Peterson Creek Dam has been compromised. Imminent flooding expected in low-lying areas. All residents in the affected zone must evacuate immediately." Jim and Ellie exchanged a long look, one that contained 42 years of partnership, of weathering storms both literal and metaphorical together. "We still have time to leave," Ellie said softly. Jim shook his head, his decision made hours ago. "You go, take the truck, I'll stay with the house." And with them, his gesture encompassed both the exposed section of floor and Max, who had returned to stand vigilant beside the opening. "James Calloway," Ellie said, using his full name as she only did in moments of profound seriousness. "If you think I'm leaving you here after all these years, you've finally lost your mind completely." Despite everything, Jim felt a smile tug at the corner of his mouth. Stubborn woman. It was what had drawn him to her in that VA hospital so many years ago, her quiet, immovable strength. Another ominous creak from the floor interrupted their standoff. This time, it was accompanied by a visible shift in one of the support beams they'd installed, a subtle but unmistakable buckling under pressure from below. "If we're staying, we need to move our emergency supplies upstairs," Jim said, military pragmatism taking over. "And we need better support for that beam." They worked quickly in the inadequate light, Jim directing Ellie to find specific tools and materials from his workshop while he assessed the shifting structure. Max remained unnervingly focused on the exposed crawl space, occasionally emitting low whines that raised the hair on the back of Jim's neck. "What is it, boy?" Jim murmured, pausing in his work to stroke the shepherd's head. "What are you still trying to tell me?" Max's only response was to edge closer to the opening, his entire body tense with concentration. Jim played his flashlight beam across the visible portion of the crawl space. The rising groundwater now formed a shallow, murky pool below, reflecting the light in eerie patterns. As he watched, tiny rivulets began to form, water finding its way through the packed earth that had concealed Bravo's resting place for decades. With sudden clarity, Jim understood Max's continued agitation. "He's being uncovered," he said aloud. "The water's exposing him," Ellie returned, arms full of lumber scraps and rope. "What? Oh, Bravo. The water's disturbing his grave." Jim took the materials and began fashioning an additional brace. Robert Morton buried him down there to keep him safe, hidden. Now the flood is washing him away. Before Ellie could respond, a new sound cut through the storm's cacophony, a deep, resonant crack that seemed to originate from the very bones of the house. The floor visibly shifted, the temporary supports groaning under increasing pressure. "Jim!" Ellie cried, reaching for him as he knelt dangerously close to the weakened section. "I need to reinforce this now," he replied grimly, "or we'll lose the whole central beam." Outside, the roar of water grew louder. No longer just the sound of heavy rain, but something more ominous, the inexorable approach of the flood surge from the failed dam. Max began to bark again, not at the floor this time, but toward the front of the house. Warning of this new, immediate danger, Jim worked with desperate efficiency, his hands moving with the muscle memory of decades in construction. Ellie held the flashlight steady, illuminating his efforts as the minutes ticked by with excruciating slowness. A sudden, violent shudder ran through the entire structure. Ellie stumbled, catching herself against the wall as picture frames crashed to the floor around her. "It's time to move upstairs," Jim said, driving the last support into place. "This won't hold indefinitely, but it might buy us some time." They had just gathered their emergency supplies when they heard it, a sound like a freight train approaching. Growing louder by the second, Max's barking reached a frenzied pitch as Jim threw open the front door to witness a sight he'd never forget: a wall of water, 6 feet high and carrying debris of all sizes, surging across their property toward the house. "Run!" he shouted, shoving the emergency pack into Ellie's arms and pushing her toward the stairs. "Max, come." The three of them scrambled up the narrow staircase as the flood hit the house with the force of a battering ram. The structure shook violently, timbers groaning in protest as water exploded through doors and windows on the ground floor. Jim stumbled on the top step, his bad knee finally betraying him. But Ellie and Max were there, pulling and pushing him to safety as water churned below. They retreated to the master bedroom at the highest point of the house, closing the door as if that flimsy barrier could hold back the deluge. Through the window, Jim could see only water where his farm had been, punctuated by the skeletal tops of fences and smaller outbuildings. The barn, built on slightly higher ground, still stood, though water surged around its foundation. Inside the house, the destruction continued. They felt each impact as debris carried by the floodwaters slammed into the structure. The floor beneath their feet trembled continuously now. The old house fighting a losing battle against nature's fury. "The floor's going to collapse," Jim said, his voice strangely calm as he helped Ellie push their heavy oak dresser against the door to block the rising water. "We'll be okay," Ellie insisted, though her voice wavered. "The second floor is sound. We just need to wait it out." Jim didn't contradict her, but they both knew the truth. If the central support beam failed completely, it could bring down portions of the second floor as well. The integrity of the entire structure was now compromised. Max paced the bedroom anxiously, moving from window to window before returning to press against Jim's leg, as if trying to communicate something urgent. The dog's fur was soaked from their dash upstairs, but his focus remained intense, unwavering. A tremendous crash from below made them all jump. The distinctive sound of splintering wood was followed by a lurching sensation, as if the very floor beneath them had dropped several inches. "That was the central beam," Jim said grimly. "Living room floor's gone." Ellie moved to the window, peering out into the storm-tossed darkness. "Any sign of rescue teams?" Jim joined her, squinting against the rain. In the distance, he could make out flashing lights on the highway, emergency vehicles gathered at the roadblock, unable to reach the flooded valley properties. "They're there, but they can't get to us through this. We're on our own, at least until morning." Another violent shudder ran through the house, followed by the unmistakable sound of rushing water directly below their bedroom. The flood had breached the interior of the second floor. "We need to get higher," Jim said, already moving toward the small attic access in their ceiling. Grab the emergency pack." With painful slowness, he managed to push open the attic hatch and pull down the folding ladder. Ellie climbed up first with their supplies, then helped guide Max as Jim lifted the reluctant shepherd toward the opening. Jim was halfway up the ladder when the bedroom floor gave way beneath him. One moment he was climbing, the next he was falling. The ladder torn from its moorings as a section of ceiling collapsed. He heard Ellie's scream, felt Max's teeth close around his jacket sleeve in a desperate attempt to hold him. Then he was plunging downward as the house seemed to disintegrate around him. The impact drove the air from his lungs. Cold water engulfed him, along with chunks of plaster, wood, and insulation. Disoriented, Jim fought to determine which way was up in the churning debris field. His lungs burned for air. His bad leg tangled in something unseen below the surface, just as black spots began to dance at the edges of his vision. A powerful force grabbed him, not the current, but something deliberate. Max, the shepherd, had leapt down after him and now gripped his jacket collar, pulling with all his considerable strength toward a pocket of air near what remained of the staircase. Jim's head broke the surface and he gasped painfully, coughing up water as he clung to a piece of banister still attached to the wall. Max treaded water beside him, refusing to leave even as the current threatened to sweep them both away. "Ellie!" Jim shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the flood. "Ellie!" From somewhere above, he heard her frantic response. "Jim, I'm here. The attic's still intact." Relief flooded through him, quickly replaced by a new urgency. The water continued to rise, and his makeshift handhold wouldn't last much longer. With Max still beside him, Jim began to fight his way toward the remains of the staircase, hoping to find a path back up to Ellie. In that moment, as he struggled against the current with his faithful shepherd at his side, Jim Calloway finally understood what had driven Robert Morton to risk everything to bring Bravo home from Vietnam. Some bonds transcended ordinary explanation, some loyalties ran soul deep. And as the floodwaters surged around them, threatening to claim another soldier and his dog, Jim made a silent promise to the man he'd never met, but whose pain he now shared. "I won't leave him behind. Not this time." The water was relentless. Each time Jim managed to gain a few inches toward what remained of the staircase, the current would surge, threatening to tear away his tenuous grip on the splintered banister. His soaked clothes weighed him down like armor, and the cold had already numbed his extremities to clumsy dead weight. Worst of all, his bad knee, the one that still held Vietnamese shrapnel, had seized completely, rendering his left leg useless against the flood's power. "Max, go," Jim gasped, pushing weakly at the shepherd who refused to leave his side. "Find Ellie." But Max understood loyalty in a way that transcended human language. The dog remained steadfast, occasionally gripping Jim's jacket in his powerful jaws to help stabilize him against particularly violent surges. In the dog's unwavering dedication, Jim saw echoes of another shepherd from decades past, King, his unit's scout dog, who had once pulled Jim behind cover seconds before sniper fire riddled their position. A fresh torrent of water cascaded down what remained of the stairwell, bringing with it a shower of debris. Something struck Jim's temple, a picture frame. He realized dimly, watching his own blood dilute into the murky water. The family photo it had contained Jim and Ellie on their 30th anniversary swirled away into the darkness. "Jim," Ellie's voice reached him from above, barely audible over the storm's fury. "Jim, answer me." He tried to respond, but another wave washed over him, filling his mouth with gritty water. When he resurfaced, coughing violently, he realized with horror that the level had risen another foot in just minutes. At this rate, the entire first floor would be completely submerged within the hour. The house groaned around them, a deep, structural protest that vibrated through the remaining timbers. Jim knew that sound intimately from his construction days. It was the sound of imminent collapse. Jim Calloway. Ellie's voice had taken on the commanding tone she'd used during her nursing days, the one that had cowed Army officers and panicked recruits alike. "You listen to me right now. You find a way up here, or so help me God." Her words cut through his growing resignation, igniting a spark of determination. Eleanor Calloway had not stood by him through 42 years of marriage, through nightmares and therapy, and the long, slow process of healing, just to lose him to Peterson Creek in their 60s. With renewed focus, Jim assessed his surroundings. The main staircase was largely destroyed, but part of the structure remained attached to the wall. If he could reach a jutting beam about 6 feet away, he might be able to pull himself up to more stable footing. "Max," he commanded, summoning the authoritative tone he hadn't used since Vietnam. "Perch." He pointed toward the beam. The German shepherd seemed to understand instantly. With powerful strokes, Max swam toward the indicated position, finding purchase on the beam with his front paws. Once stable, he turned back toward Jim, attention locked on his human partner. Jim took a deep breath and released his hold on the banister, immediately feeling the current grab him. But before it could sweep him away entirely, he directed his drift toward Max, using his good leg and arms to propel himself through the swirling water. For a terrifying moment, he thought he'd miscalculated. The current was stronger than anticipated, threatening to carry him past his target. Then Max lunged forward, teeth clamping onto Jim's jacket sleeve. The sudden anchor point allowed Jim to twist his body and grab the edge of the beam with desperate fingers, inch by painful inch. With Max alternately pulling at his clothing and stabilizing him with his body, Jim hauled himself onto the relatively dry remnant of the landing. The effort left him gasping, every muscle trembling with exhaustion and cold. "I'm up," he called weakly to Ellie. "On the landing." Her relieved sob carried down to him. "Can you see a way to the attic?" Jim raised his head, squinting through the intermittent beam of his one remaining flashlight. The main staircase to the second floor was gone, but where the hallway had collapsed, it created an unintentional ramp of broken timber and drywall that led upward toward the partial second floor. If he could climb that precarious slope— Another violent shudder ran through the house. This time, it was accompanied by a sound like thunder, not from the sky, but from beneath the foundation. Jim felt the vibration in his very bones. "The main support's going," he called up to Ellie, struggling to his feet. "We don't have much time." With Max pressing close against his side, providing stability to his bad leg, Jim began the treacherous ascent up the incline of debris. Each step was a negotiation, testing weight, adjusting for shifting materials, pausing when the structure protested too loudly. Halfway up, disaster struck. A section of flooring that had seemed solid suddenly gave way beneath Jim's good leg, plunging him knee-deep into splintered timber. He cried out as jagged wood sliced into his thigh, hot blood immediately soaking his already wet pants. Max was there in an instant, bracing himself against Jim's side, offering his substantial body as leverage. With a strangled groan, Jim pulled his injured leg free, the pain nearly causing him to black out. "Jim!" Ellie's panicked voice seemed to come from very far away. "I'm hit," he managed, pressing his hand against the wound. "Leg's cut bad." The injury brought with it a terrible clarity. He wasn't going to make it up this improvised ramp, not with one leg now completely useless and blood flowing freely from the other. The cold calculation he'd learned in combat took over the dispassionate assessment of survival odds that had kept him alive in the jungle half a century ago. Ellie, he called. His voice stronger now that decision had replaced uncertainty. Listen carefully. Take the emergency pack and get onto the roof. The water's still rising, but the highest point of the house should stay above it. Not without you, she responded immediately. Eleanor. He used her full name, something he rarely did. I can't make it up. My leg's torn open, and I'm losing blood fast. You need to get to higher ground now. Her silence told him she understood the gravity of the situation. Max will help you, Jim continued, turning to the shepherd beside him. Max, go to Ellie. Go. But Max remained immovable, his dark eyes fixed on Jim with a determination that transcended training. Another juddering crash from below reminded them that the house itself was the most immediate threat. The central support beam must have failed completely, because the entire structure tilted slightly, debris sliding into the water around them. In that moment, as Jim clung to the shifting wreckage of his ancestral home with his faithful dog beside him, he was suddenly acutely aware of the parallels to Robert Morton's life. Another soldier who had returned broken from an unpopular war, another man who had found his greatest solace in the uncomplicated loyalty of a military dog, another story that might end here, beneath these waters, leaving barely a ripple in the wider world's consciousness. I understand now, Jim whispered, one hand buried in Max's wet fur. I understand why you couldn't leave him behind, Robert, and why you kept him close, even after. The thought remained unfinished as another section of the house gave way with a deafening crack. The platform where Jim and Max had found temporary refuge lurched sickeningly, dropping several feet before jamming against broken support beams. The sudden movement sent waves of agony through Jim's injured legs. Darkness crowded the edges of his vision, consciousness beginning to slip away as blood loss and hypothermia took their toll. His last clear thought was of Ellie hoping she had found her way to the roof, praying she would survive this night. As blackness claimed him, Jim felt the solid warmth of Max pressing against his side. The dog's body curled protectively around him, despite the precarious angle of their perch. In that final moment of awareness, he understood completely what Robert Morton had known: some loyalties run deeper than human understanding. Some bonds stronger than logic or self-preservation. Some dogs simply do not leave their soldiers behind. The first sensation Jim registered was pain, sharp, insistent, radiating from his legs upward. The second was sound, not the roaring destruction of the flood, but rhythmic mechanical thumping that seemed to vibrate through his very bones. The third was pressure across his chest and legs, firm but gentle. Holding him secure, he forced his eyes open to blinding daylight and confusion. Blue sky wheeled overhead. The mechanical sound intensified. A face appeared above him, not Ellie's, but a young woman in a flight helmet. Mr. Calloway, can you hear me? You're in a Nebraska National Guard helicopter. We're taking you to Lincoln Medical Center. Helicopter, the word triggered an avalanche of memories. Medevac choppers lifting wounded men from jungle clearings. The distinctive whump, whump, whump of Huey blades cutting through humid air. For a disorienting moment, Jim wasn't sure which war he was in. My wife, he croaked, his throat raw. Ellie? The medic's expression softened. She's in the other helicopter. She's okay, hypothermia and exhaustion, but stable. Relief washed through him so powerfully it brought tears to his eyes. Ellie was alive, whatever else had happened, whatever they had lost. Ellie had survived. Max. The name emerged as barely a whisper. The medic glanced toward the front of the helicopter, then back to Jim. Your dog, He's right here. Wouldn't leave your side but a rescue worker who tried to separate you. Had to bring him along." Jim turned his head, ignoring the stabbing pain the movement caused, and saw Max secured in a harness near his feet. The German shepherd's eyes were fixed intently on Jim's face, ears forward in alert vigilance despite the noise and unfamiliar surroundings. "Good boy," Jim murmured. Before darkness claimed him again, he woke next in the sterile quiet of a hospital room. The steady beep of monitoring equipment replaced the helicopter's roar. Daylight slanted through half-closed blinds, indicating late afternoon. Jim tried to sit up, only to discover his left leg immobilized in a substantial bandage and his right knee wrapped tightly. "Easy there, soldier." The voice came from his left. Jim turned to find Bill Henderson dozing in a vinyl chair, his weathered face creased with exhaustion. "Bill." Jim's voice emerged as a rasp. "Ellie." Bill straightened, instantly alert. "Down the hall. They're treating her for exposure and some cuts. But she'll be fine. Tough woman. You're Ellie." "The house." Bill's expression told him everything before the words came. "It's gone." "Jim, foundation's still there, but the structure, the flood took it. I'm sorry." Jim absorbed this with a strange emotional numbness. The house that had sheltered generations of Callaways. The home where he and Ellie had built their life together. Reduced to nothing in a single night. "Max." At this, Bill managed a smile. "Now that's a story. That dog of yours wouldn't let the rescue team near you. They had to tranquilize him to get you on the stretcher. Then he woke up halfway to the evacuation point and nearly took a ranger's arm off trying to get back to you. National Guard finally gave up and just brought him along in the chopper. Where is he now? Animal control facility. Don't worry. I told them his history. Made sure they're treating him right. He's a hero. Jim, local news is already calling him the Flood Sentinel. Once you're stable, I expect they'll release him to Ellie." Jim nodded, relief mingling with a deeper emotion he couldn't quite name. Max had stayed despite the flood, despite the danger, despite better options. Max had refused to leave his side, like Bravo must have stayed with Robert Morton through whatever demons haunted his return from Vietnam. "Bill," Jim said suddenly, "did they find anything unusual in what's left of the house?" The older man's expression shifted subtly. "You mean besides the military dog tags and the remains of a German shepherd buried under your living room floor? Tags that match records of a K-9 unit declared lost in action in 1970. Jim closed his eyes. "So they found him." "Jim," Bill's voice was gentle but firm, "I need you to understand something. What those rescue workers found, it's being treated with respect. The county Veterans Affairs officer is involved. There's talk of a proper military burial for Bravo, with honors." A pressure Jim hadn't realized he was carrying seemed to ease slightly. "Robert Morton brought him home," he said quietly. "Against regulations. Against everything. He couldn't leave his partner behind." "No, he couldn't," Bill agreed. "And now we understand why." The door opened, admitting a doctor, and behind her, Ellie in a wheelchair pushed by a nurse, at the sight of his wife pale but alert, a bandage across her forehead but otherwise intact. Jim felt the emotional dam finally break. Tears spilled down his weathered cheeks as she reached for his hand. "You made it to the roof," he managed. Ellie's grip tightened on his fingers. "I couldn't leave you down there. I was trying to find another way to reach you when the rescue team arrived." The doctor cleared her throat gently. "Mr. Calloway, you've suffered a significant laceration to your right thigh, requiring 47 stitches. Your left knee has sustained further damage to the joint, likely requiring surgery once the swelling subsides. You also experienced moderate hypothermia and blood loss. However, given prompt treatment, we expect a full recovery, though physical therapy will be essential. Jim nodded absently, his focus still on Ellie. The rest, the injuries, the recovery, even the loss of their home seemed secondary now. They had survived. Against all odds, against the fury of the flood and the collapse of the house, they had made it through together. As the doctor continued outlining his treatment plan, Jim found his thoughts drifting to Robert Morton, the soldier who had returned from one war only to fight another, more private battle at home, who had found his greatest comfort in the presence of a dog that understood his pain without judgment or explanation, who had, in the end, been unable to part with that companion, even in death. "There's something else you should know," Bill said when the doctor had finished and left them alone. "The County Historical Society has been going through their records. Turns out, Robert Morton didn't just bring Bravo home illegally. He spent years after Vietnam advocating for military working dogs, wrote letters to congressmen, organized local veterans. His efforts were part of what eventually led to the 2000 law that allowed military dogs to be adopted after service. He tried to make it right," Ellie said softly. "For all the other dogs. For all the other Bravos," Jim corrected, thinking of King, the shepherd who had saved his platoon only to be left behind when the troops withdrew. "For all the partners we couldn't bring home." The revelation settled over them like a benediction, the knowledge that Robert Morton's pain had ultimately created change, that his private act of defiance had helped pave the way for a more humane policy. 3 days later, Jim sat in a wheelchair on the hospital's covered entrance, waiting for Bill Henderson to bring the truck around. His right thigh throbbed beneath its bandages, and his damaged knee still refused to bend properly. But the doctors had finally agreed to discharge him to Ellie's care. They would stay with the Hendersons until they decided what to do next, whether to rebuild on the old foundation or perhaps find somewhere new to start over. "Ready?" Ellie asked, standing beside him with her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. Before Jim could answer, a familiar bark cut through the hospital sounds. Looking up, he saw Bill's pickup pulling to the curb, and in the bed of the truck, secured by a special harness but alert and vibrating with excitement, was Max. The German shepherd's bark transformed into a high-pitched whine of recognition as he spotted Jim. Bill hurried to help the dog down, but Max was already scrambling over the tailgate, dragging his leash behind him as he raced toward Jim. Hospital protocol forgotten. The shepherd threw himself against Jim's legs, nearly toppling the wheelchair in his enthusiasm. "Easy, boy," Jim laughed, his hands finding the familiar contours of Max's head, smoothing the velvety ears while the dog alternated between frantic licks and joyful whines. "I'm here. I'm okay." As he leaned forward to embrace his loyal companion, Jim noticed something new attached to Max's collar, a small metal tag that caught the sunlight. Curious. He turned it over in his fingers. It was one of Bravo's military identification tags, cleaned and polished, newly attached to Max's collar beside his regular ID. The Veterans Affairs officer thought it was appropriate, Bill explained, watching the reunion with suspicion moisture in his eyes. Said something about passing the torch from one service dog to another. Jim's vision blurred as his fingers closed around the tag. In that small piece of metal lay so many stories of loyalty and loss, of battles fought both abroad and at home, of the unique bond between soldiers and the dogs who stand beside them in the darkest hours. "Thank you," Jim whispered, not sure if he was addressing Bill or the Veterans Affairs officer, or Robert Morton's memory, or perhaps some higher power that had orchestrated this strange, powerful convergence of past and present. Max pressed closer, his warm weight against Jim's legs, a living reminder of what had been saved from the flood. Not just lives, but a legacy of devotion that transcended time and tragedy. 6 months after the flood, Jim Calloway stood on the newly poured concrete foundation of what would soon be his and Ellie's new home. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the cleared land, where construction materials lay in neat piles waiting for the framing to begin. The old foundation had been too damaged to salvage, forcing them to start completely anew, a clean slate rising from the mud and debris the flood had left behind. Jim leaned slightly on his cane, a concession to his reconstructed knee that the doctors assured him would be temporary. Beside him, Max surveyed the property with the alertness that had never diminished, Bravo's military tag catching the sunlight as it hung from his collar. "What do you think, boy?" Jim asked, scratching behind the shepherd's ears. "It'll be different, but it'll be home." And Max leaned into the touch, his steady presence a comfort Jim had come to rely on more openly since the flood. The nightmares had returned in the weeks following their rescue, not just memories of Vietnam this time, but terrifying dreams of dark water rising, of Ellie's voice calling from beyond reach, of Max being swept away while Jim remained helplessly pinned beneath debris. On those nights, it was Max who woke him, the dog's insistent nudging pulling Jim back to reality before the dreams could fully claim him. "The lumber delivery is coming tomorrow," Ellie called as she emerged from the Hendersons' pickup truck, carrying a thermos and 2 cups. In the months since losing their home, they had stayed in the Hendersons' guest room, their friends refusing all offers of rent or compensation. "Bill says the veterans group will be here Saturday to help with the framing." Jim nodded, accepting the steaming cup she offered. "Did you tell them they don't need to do that? I've got contractors lined up." Ellie's smile was knowing. "I did," they said, and I quote, "Tell that stubborn old Marine that his Army brothers aren't asking permission." A reluctant chuckle escaped Jim. In the aftermath of the flood, something unexpected had happened in their small community. The story of Robert Morton, Bravo, and Max's heroism had spread, drawing together veterans from across 3 counties. Men Jim had lived alongside for decades, but barely spoken to, suddenly appeared at the Hendersons' door, offering help, sharing stories, forming connections that should have existed years earlier. "I stopped by the cemetery on my way back," Ellie said more softly, her free hand finding Jim's. "The marker looks beautiful." Jim squeezed her fingers, emotion tightening his throat. In a quiet corner of the county veterans' cemetery, a small but dignified stone now stood, "Bravo, Military Working Dog, Vietnam, faithfully served." Beneath it, in smaller letters, "and Robert Morton, handler, who brought him home." The discovery of Bravo's remains had sparked something of a local movement. The County Historical Society had pieced together more of Robert Morton's story through military records, letters, and accounts from elderly neighbors who remembered the quiet veteran and his inseparable German shepherd. What emerged was a portrait of a man who had returned from war deeply damaged, but who had channeled his pain into advocacy for the military dogs left behind, writing letters, attending meetings, refusing to let Bravo's comrades be forgotten. "The school principal called," Ellie continued, sipping her coffee. "She wants to know if you'd reconsider speaking to the high school history class about Vietnam, specifically about the military working dogs." Jim gazed out over the property, to where the creek now returned to its usual gentle flow marked the eastern boundary. For most of his life, he had refused to discuss Vietnam, believing silence was the only appropriate response to memories too painful to revisit. But something had shifted in these past months. Perhaps it was his brush with mortality during the flood, or the discovery of Robert Morton's parallel journey, or simply the perspective that comes from losing almost everything and finding oneself still standing. "Maybe," he said finally, "if Max can come too." Ellie's smile widened. "I think that can be arranged." They stood in companionable silence, watching the sun sink lower toward the horizon. The foundation beneath their feet represented more than just a new structure. It was a second chance, a fresh start built upon deeper understanding of the past. A vehicle approached on the long gravel drive, dust billowing behind it. As it drew closer, Jim recognized Bill Henderson's son, Tom, who worked for the county clerk's office. "Glad I caught you, folks," Tom called as he climbed from his car, manila envelope in hand. "Found something in the archives you might want to see." He handed the envelope to Jim, who carefully extracted its contents: photocopies of yellowed newspaper clippings and what appeared to be a partial manuscript. "It's Robert Morton's writings," Tom explained. "Apparently, he was working on a book about military dogs in Vietnam. Never published it, of course, but the Historical Society had his papers donated after he passed. When all this came up about Bravo, they started going through the archives more carefully." Jim's hands were not quite steady as he scanned the pages. Robert Morton's precise handwriting filled the margins of the typescript, making corrections and additions to accounts of dog teams serving in various combat zones, including, Jim noticed with a jolt, a brief mention of King, the shepherd who had saved Jim's own platoon. "He was documenting all of them," Jim said softly, "making sure they wouldn't be forgotten." "There's more," Tom said. "The Historical Society wants to complete his work, publish it as a tribute to both Morton and the dogs he tried to honor. They're looking for other veterans to contribute their stories." Jim looked down at Max, who sat alert at his side, then out at the foundation of his new home, and finally to Ellie, whose eyes held the same steady support they had offered for more than 4 decades. "Yes," he said simply, "I think I'd like to tell King's story, and Max's." As if understanding, Max pressed closer against Jim's leg, the tag on his collar. Bravo's tag catching the last golden light of day. In that moment, Jim felt a circle closing, a connection completed between past and present, between the young soldier he had been and the old one he had become, between all the faithful companions who had stood watch beside American soldiers in their darkest hours. The secret beneath the floor had been revealed. Not to destroy, but to heal, not just an old house, but an old warrior's heart. They say some bonds transcend understanding, like the silent communication between a soldier and his dog, or the unspoken promise between those who've faced combat together. Jim Calloway's story reminds us that healing often comes when we least expect it, sometimes from beneath the very floors we've walked on for decades. For many of us who served, who came home carrying burdens invisible to others, the real flood isn't water but memories rising unbidden in the night, threatening to sweep away the lives we've carefully rebuilt. We recognize ourselves in Jim's reluctance to speak of the past, in Robert Morton's quiet dedication to making things right, in Max's unwavering loyalty despite all logic and self-preservation. Perhaps what touches us most deeply is the recognition that our stories don't end when we return home, that the dogs we left behind, the comrades we couldn't save, the words we couldn't speak for decades, all these deserve acknowledgement, like Bravo's tags finding new purpose on Max's collar. Our past experiences can become not just burdens, but bridges connecting us to younger generations who need to understand, to communities ready to support us, and to the peace that comes from finally bringing everything, even the painful parts, home where they belong. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.